In the heart of Port of Spain, a small but significant structure can be found tucked away on Sackville Street. This seemingly innocuous little building is one of the few remaining examples of our Spanish architectural heritage and likely part of our governmental history. It is believed to have belonged to the illustrious board of the Cabildo, an administrative council that existed during Spanish colonial rule. When Trinidad was a colony of Spain, the Cabildo exercised wide executive powers, but were mainly responsible for the governance of the bigger towns.
There was a small council of partly elected, partly appointed gentlemen. You had to be male, you had to be white, you had to be a Christian, a Catholic Christian, and you had to own some property in the city. Those were the requirements.
In 1797, when the British seized power from Spain, Governor Colonel Thomas Picton chose not to abolish the Cabildo. On old maps of Port of Spain, this building on Sackville Street was labelled the Cabildo. During restoration work, carbon dating confirmed the building was approximately 200 years old. But its actual function continues to be a source of speculation.
Cabildo buildings were probably built in the early 1800s, but definitely Spanish style. The architecture is quite clearly Spanish. And there's good reason to think that the Cabildo did meet in that building.
However, restoration architects have a different opinion. Their examination of the foundations of the Cabildo building found it was once part of a larger complex.
On some of the old maps around 1800, we see it called the Cabildo, but it's far too small a building to have been the headquarters for the illustrious Cabildo. It's no way. So we suspect that it may have been an out office, maybe a registry for birth and deaths, for instance, not necessarily where the Cabildo met, where the town hall was. Or it may have been a building that after one of the fires, because we know that the town hall burnt down more than once, it might have been used as a temporary quarters, which is why we now think of it and it's now called the Cabildo.
So I mean, it's unlikely that it was the Cabildo. It may have been owned by the Cabildo, it may have been owned by somebody who was senior in the Cabildo, which I strongly suspect, or maybe the Cabildo had a series of houses for their staff or their councillors.
Despite speculation on its usage, the building on Sackville Street is undeniably an important example of our Spanish architectural heritage. Built in 1826, the details of the building are typical of domestic urban structures seen in other Spanish colonies.
The Cabildo house is Spanish style. There is a small fountain in the courtyard. It opens directly onto the street and there are very, very thick walls. There is that whole very Moorish Latin feel to it. And it is one of the examples of Spanish architecture in Trinidad that have survived.
The building is introspective in terms of style and was well designed for the tropics.
It's a delightful space, really. You don't even think that you're going to, when you walk in here, you're going to suddenly come onto an interior courtyard. And if you go again back to Venezuela, Cuba, the floor plan is typical. That you walk in, you pass one or two rooms, and it just opens up in the middle. Tropical architecture, the air comes through the door, it circulates, and it goes up through the middle of the building.
By the 1830s, however, the British wanted to establish firmer control over their colony and set about Anglicizing Trinidad, making laws and institutions more British. As they began bringing an end to slavery, they came up against strong resistance from the Cabildo.
Now the Cabildo, stuffed with slaveholders, used the institution to fight tooth and nail against Britain's slave policies. So for those reasons, plus the fact it was a Spanish institution, clearly its time was limited. It was abolished in 1840 and replaced by an English type of borough council.
The Cabildo Building was left abandoned for many years and fell into ruin. It was saved from demolition in the 1980s by the efforts of the Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects, spearheaded by Adrian Camp's Campins. Today, the Cabildo Building has found new life as a law museum. Handcrafted mesquite furniture was made for the building in 18th century style. A sculpted Spanish-styled fountain was installed where the original fountain stood.
Turning it into the law museum, which has been done, has given it a lift, a boost that is extremely important, and will make people conscious of the importance of, the restoration of old buildings.
Many of Port of Spain's historical structures from 200 years ago have been destroyed by fire or urbanization over the centuries. This is why the Cabildo is so important in our architectural landscape.
Even though this building that we call the Cabildo was built during the early part of the British era, it is the only thing we have left of Spanish influence in Port of Spain. So it's important to keep it, to remind us that we do have a Spanish heritage, and that the Spaniards were here before the British came.
Now a listed heritage site, this small but significant building is a link to our Spanish colonial past. With its new function as home to the Law Museum, hopefully it will be appreciated for generations to come.